Before you complain about being hungry between meals, let me tell you about people who were lucky to eat once every 3 days. People who considered mouldy bread a feast, who fought over scraps that modern people would throw in the garbage, who literally ate dirt when there was nothing else. This is the story of medieval peasants and their struggle for survival in a world designed to keep them starving. Before we dive into this heartbreaking journey through medieval hunger, I'm curious, where are you watching this right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. Are you somewhere with easy access to food? Maybe with snacks nearby or a full refrigerator just steps away? I love hearing from viewers around the world. And if this exploration of medieval peasant life makes you appreciate every meal you have, please hit that like button and subscribe for more eye-opening stories from history. Your support means everything and helps me bring you these important historical truths. What you're about to hear will fundamentally change how you think about hunger, poverty, and human survival. This isn't just about being poor. This is about existing in a state of perpetual desperation, where every day brings the possibility of death from starvation. So settle in, maybe grab a snack to appreciate while you listen, and let me show you why being a medieval peasant was literally a life sentence of hunger and desperation that would break anyone alive today. Imagine waking up in a small dark hut somewhere in 13th century England. The year is 1315, and outside your thin walls, the rain has been falling for months. But this isn't just weather. This is the beginning of what historians call the Great Famine. 7 years of crop failures that would kill millions across Europe. As you lie on your straw mattress, listening to the endless rain, you already know that you might not survive the year. But here's the thing that modern people can't truly comprehend. For a medieval peasant, this famine isn't a crisis. It's just life getting a little worse than usual. You've never known food security. You've never experienced the luxury of eating until you're full. You've never had the comfort of knowing where your next meal will come from. You've spent your entire life dancing on the knife's edge of starvation, and now that knife has simply gotten a little sharper. Let's start with the most fundamental fact about medieval peasant life. You don't own anything. Not your land, not your house, not your tools, not even your own body. You are what's called a serf, which is essentially a slave with slightly better marketing. You belong to a lord who owns everything you see and everything you'll ever see. Your life exists solely to generate profit for someone else. And that profit is extracted from you in ways so comprehensive and merciless that it's amazing anyone survived at all. The feudal system that governs your life is brilliantly designed to keep you in a state of perpetual desperation. You work a small plot of land that belongs to your lord, and in exchange for the privilege of not being thrown off that land to die, you owe him a portion of everything you produce. But it's not just a portion, it's typically between half and 3/4 of everything you grow. Let's do the math that determines whether you live or die. Say you manage to grow 100 bushels of grain in a good year, and good years are rare. Your lord immediately takes 60 bushels as rent and taxes. The church takes another 10 bushels as tithe, because God apparently needs your food more than your starving children do. Various other obligations, road maintenance, bridge repair, military service, take another 10 bushels worth of your time and labour. That leaves you with 20 bushels to feed your family for an entire year. A single person needs about 15 bushels to survive at subsistence level. You have a wife and 3 children. Do the math. It's impossible. There literally isn't enough food to keep your family alive, even in a good year. This isn't mismanagement or bad luck. This is the system working exactly as designed. But it gets worse. Those 20 bushels aren't all grain. You need to save some seeds for next year's planting, or you'll have nothing to grow at all. So now you're down to maybe bushels for food. And that's assuming nothing goes wrong. If a single harvest fails, If taxes are raised, if your lord decides he needs more to fund a war or a wedding or a new castle, you simply die. The economic pressures on medieval peasants were so extreme that families regularly made decisions that would horrify modern people. Children were abandoned at monasteries not because their parents didn't love them, but because the monasteries at least had a chance of feeding them. Parents would sell themselves into slavery to buy food for their children. Entire families would walk away from their homes to beg in other regions, hoping to find some lord who might be slightly less extractive than their current one. The labour demands placed on peasants were calculated to extract maximum value while keeping them just barely alive enough to work. You owe your lord not just a percentage of your crops, but also a certain number of days of labour on his land. This is called corvée labour, and it typically amounts to 3 or 4 days a week during the growing season. So while your own crops are dying from lack of attention, you're required to work on your lord's land, ensuring that he has plenty to eat while you starve. The timing of these labour obligations was deliberately cruel. You owe the most workdays during planting and harvest, exactly when your own survival depends on working your own land. Your lord's crops get planted and harvested by well-fed workers during optimal conditions, while you try to tend your own land during whatever time is left over, often working by moonlight or in the early hours before dawn. But the economic extraction doesn't stop with crops and labour. Medieval lords had developed dozens of ways to squeeze money and resources out of their peasants. You can't grind your grain without using the lord's mill and paying a fee. You can't bake bread without using the lord's oven and paying a fee. You can't brew ale without paying a fee. If you want to get married, you pay a fee. If you want to inherit your father's land, you pay a fee. If you want to leave the village to look for work elsewhere, you pay a fee, assuming your lord gives permission at all. These fees aren't small amounts proportional to peasant income. They're designed to capture any tiny surplus that a peasant family might accumulate. If you somehow manage to save a little money or extra food, the lord's economic system will find a way to take it. The goal isn't just to extract wealth, it's to ensure that peasants never accumulate enough resources to become independent or to challenge the system. The legal system reinforces this economic oppression in ways that make escape virtually impossible. As a serf, you can't own land, you can't move freely, you can't choose your occupation, and you can't even choose who you marry without your lord's permission. If you try to run away, you're legally a thief who has stolen yourself from your rightful owner. Other lords are required to return you, and the punishment for attempted escape is typically a beating severe enough to prevent you from trying again. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the medieval economic system is how it's justified. You're told that this arrangement is natural, ordained by God, and beneficial to everyone involved. The Lord protects you from bandits and foreign armies. The church provides spiritual guidance and the promise of eternal reward for your earthly suffering. You're told that your poverty is a virtue, that your hunger brings you closer to God, that your suffering in this life will be rewarded in the next. This ideological framework is crucial to the system's stability. If peasants understood that their starvation was a choice made by their lords rather than a natural law, they might rebel. But when you're told from birth that inequality is God's will, and that your role is to suffer while others prosper, resistance becomes not just difficult, but literally unthinkable. The church plays a vital role in maintaining this economic oppression, while taking its own substantial cut of peasant production through tithes and fees. It preaches that poverty is blessed and that the poor will inherit the earth. It's a brilliant psychological manipulation, turns suffering into a virtue, and you can convince people to accept any amount of exploitation. But let's get specific about what this means in practical terms. Your typical medieval peasant family lives in a 1 or 2 room hut with walls made of wattle and daub, basically sticks and mud. The floor is dirt. There are no windows, just small openings that can be covered with cloth or wood in bad weather. The roof is thatch that leaks constantly and needs frequent repair. In this tiny space, you live with your spouse, your children, and often your elderly parents. There's no privacy, no personal space, no escape from the constant awareness of everyone else's hunger and desperation. You share this space with your animals, chickens, a pig if you're lucky, maybe a cow, because you can't afford separate buildings, and the animals provide warmth in winter. Your possessions can be counted on one hand. A few cooking pots, some wooden bowls and spoons, the clothes on your back and maybe one spare set, a few tools for farming, and that's it. Everything you own could be loaded into a single cart. You have no books because you can't read. You have no decorations because you can't afford them. You have no furniture beyond a table and maybe a few stools. This material poverty might be bearable if you had enough food, but you don't. Your diet consists almost entirely of bread, and not good bread. It's made from whatever grain you can afford, often mixed with sawdust, ground bark, or other fillers to make it stretch further. In bad years, bread might be mostly peas, beans, or even acorns ground into flour. When bread isn't available, which is often, you eat pottage, a thin gruel made from whatever grains or vegetables you can find. This might be flavoured with a tiny bit of bacon fat if you're fortunate, but usually it's just grain boiled in water. It's not filling, it's not nutritious, and it's not satisfying, but it will keep you alive for another day. Meat is a luxury you might experience once or twice a year, typically at Christmas or during harvest festivals. Even then, it's usually just scraps, offal, bones with tiny bits of meat, or the meat from animals that died of disease. Fresh meat is reserved for the Lord and his household. You might taste cheese occasionally, but milk goes to make cheese for your Lord's table. Vegetables exist in your diet, but they're not the fresh, diverse vegetables that modern people eat. You grow onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips because these are hardy and can be stored through winter. But even these are luxuries when food is scarce. During famines, vegetable gardens are the first things to be abandoned as families focus all their energy on grain production. Fruit is almost unknown in your diet. Apple and pear trees might exist in the Lord's orchards, but the fruit belongs to him. Wild berries might supplement your diet briefly in summer, but these are small additions to a fundamentally inadequate food supply. The seasonal nature of food availability means that you experience cycles of relative plenty and desperate scarcity. Late summer and early fall, after the harvest, might provide a few weeks of actually feeling full, but by late winter and early spring, before the new crops come in, you're eating whatever stored food remains, and it's never enough. During these hunger months, your daily calorie intake might drop to 1,000 calories or less, about half what a modern person needs to maintain basic bodily functions. You lose weight, your immune system fails, you become susceptible to diseases that well-fed people would easily survive. Children stop growing, pregnant women miscarry, elderly people die. But here's what makes medieval peasant life so psychologically devastating. This isn't a temporary crisis that you endure knowing it will end. This is normal life. This is how things have always been and how they always will be. You were born into hunger, you'll live in hunger, and you'll die in hunger. Your children will face the same fate, and their children after them. The hopelessness of this situation is compounded by the complete absence of any social safety net. There's no unemployment insurance, no welfare system, no government assistance of any kind. If your crops fail, if you get sick, if your lord decides to raise taxes, you're on your own. Your family might help if they have anything to spare, but they're facing the same pressures you are. The church occasionally provides charity, but it's sporadic and often comes with conditions that make it as much about social control as genuine assistance. You might get a bowl of soup if you attend Mass and listen to sermons about accepting your lot in life. But this charity never addresses the fundamental economic structures that create the need for charity in the first place. This is the economic reality that defines every aspect of medieval peasant life. It's not just that you're poor, it's that you're trapped in a system specifically designed to keep you poor, hungry, and desperate. Every law, every custom, every social institution exists to ensure that you produce wealth for others while living on the edge of survival yourself. Understanding this economic foundation is crucial because everything else about peasant life, the social relationships, the working conditions, the family dynamics, the psychological stress, all flows from this basic reality of systematic economic exploitation disguised as natural order. Now that you understand the economic system designed to starve you, let's examine the actual work that consumed every moment of your waking life as a medieval peasant. This wasn't farming as modern people understand it. This was a desperate, backbreaking struggle against nature, weather, disease, and time itself, where failure meant death and success meant you get to repeat the cycle next year while remaining just as hungry. Your workday begins before dawn, not because you're enthusiastic about farming, but because you have roughly 14 hours of work to complete before darkness makes further labor impossible. There are no electric lights, no mechanical aids, no labor-saving devices of any kind. Everything must be done by hand, with tools so primitive they would look like toys to a modern gardener. Your primary tool is a wooden plough pulled by oxen if you're relatively prosperous, or by yourself and your family if you're not. This plough doesn't turn the soil like modern equipment. It merely scratches the surface, creating shallow furrows that barely disturb the earth. Each field must be ploughed multiple times to break up the ground sufficiently for planting, and each pass requires enormous physical effort to guide the plough, control the animals, and ensure the furrows are straight enough to allow for proper seed distribution. But here's the catch. You don't own the oxen. They belong to your lord, and you can only use them after his fields have been ploughed. This means that your planting happens weeks after the optimal time, reducing your potential harvest before you've even planted seeds. You watch your lord's fields being prepared and planted at exactly the right moment, while your own land sits hard and unworked, waiting for the oxen to become available. When you finally get access to draft animals, you might have only a day or two before they're needed elsewhere. This forces you to work virtually around the clock, ploughing from first light to full darkness, then doing the same again the next day. Your body aches from guiding the heavy wooden plough, your hands bleed from gripping the handles, and your back screams from the constant bending and strain. If you can't afford access to oxen at all, you and your family become the draft animals. You strap yourself to the plough and pull it across the field, while your wife and children guide it and try to keep the furrows straight. A field that might take a day to plough with oxen takes a week to plough by human power, during which time the optimal planting window slips further away and your chances of a decent harvest continue to diminish. The tools available to you are handmade from wood and iron, maintained by the village blacksmith who charges fees you can barely afford. Your ploughshares break regularly and need replacement. Your harness wears out and needs repair. Your scythe needs sharpening so frequently that you spend a significant portion of your time walking to the blacksmith's shop rather than working your fields. Planting is done entirely by hand, walking across the freshly ploughed field and broadcasting seeds from a basket slung around your shoulder. There's no precise seed distribution, no optimal spacing, no scientific approach to maximizing yields. You scatter seeds as evenly as possible and hope for the best. Much of your precious seed ends up being eaten by birds, washed away by rain, or failing to germinate due to poor soil conditions. But even the basic act of obtaining seeds for planting reveals the impossible mathematics of peasant survival. Remember, you need to save roughly 15 to 20% of your harvest as seed for next year, but you also owe 60 to 70% of your harvest to your lord and the church. This leaves you with maybe 10 to 20% for food if you have a perfect harvest with no losses to weather, disease, or pests. In reality, you almost never have a perfect harvest. Medieval agriculture was primitive and unreliable, with crop yields that were typically 3 to 4 times the amount of seed planted. Modern agriculture produces yields of 50 to 100 times the seed planted. This means that medieval peasants were operating on such thin margins that any deviation from ideal conditions resulted in famine. The crops you're allowed to grow are determined by your lord and by centuries of tradition, rather than by what would best feed your family. Much of your land must be devoted to grains that can be easily stored and transported: wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These crops provide basic calories, but lack many of the nutrients needed for health, leading to widespread malnutrition, even when people aren't technically starving. Weeding is done entirely by hand, crawling through your fields on hands and knees to remove unwanted plants one by one. This backbreaking labour must be repeated multiple times throughout the growing season, as weeds compete with your crops for the limited nutrients in the soil. A field that isn't weeded regularly will produce virtually nothing, but proper weeding requires hundreds of hours of the most physically punishing work imaginable. Pest control is almost non-existent. You have no pesticides, no biological controls, no effective methods for protecting your crops from the insects, birds, and mammals that view your fields as their personal buffet. You might set up scarecrows or employ children to throw stones at birds, but these measures are largely symbolic. A significant portion of your crop will be eaten by pests, and there's nothing you can do about it. Disease control is equally primitive. Crop diseases that modern farmers prevent or treat with fungicides and other chemicals run rampant through medieval fields. A goat fungus on rye can poison entire communities. Wheat rust can destroy a harvest virtually overnight. Blight can turn a promising crop into black, rotting stalks. When these diseases strike, you watch months of backbreaking labour reduced to nothing while knowing that your family's survival hangs in the balance. Weather is your greatest enemy and most unpredictable threat. Too much rain, and your crops rot in the field or wash away entirely. Too little rain, and they wither and die. Late frosts can kill young plants. Early frosts can destroy crops just before harvest. Hail can devastate a field in minutes. Strong winds can blow down grain just as it's reaching maturity. You have no weather forecasting, no advance warning of approaching storms, no insurance against weather-related losses. You plant your crops and pray, knowing that forces completely beyond your control will determine whether you eat or starve in the coming year. The anxiety of watching the sky and interpreting every cloud as a potential harbinger of disaster is a constant presence in your life. When harvest time finally arrives, assuming your crops have survived planting, pests, diseases, and weather, you face several weeks of the most intense physical labour of the year. Grain must be cut by hand using a sickle or scythe, requiring you to bend over and cut each stalk individually. This work must be completed quickly, as grain left standing too long will begin to drop its seeds or succumb to adverse weather. But once again, you can't harvest your own crops when they're ready. You owe labour service to your lord, and his harvest takes priority. You watch your grain becoming overripe and beginning to shatter while you're required to harvest your lord's fields first. By the time you're allowed to harvest your own crops, they may have lost 20 or 30% of their potential yield simply due to timing. The harvesting itself is brutal work that consumes every daylight hour for weeks. You cut grain in the morning, bundle it into sheaves in the afternoon, and load it onto carts in the evening. Your hands become raw and bleeding from gripping tools and handling rough grain stalks. Your back aches from the constant bending. Your arms and shoulders burn from the repetitive motions of cutting and bundling. Threshing, separating the grain from the stalks, is done by beating the harvested sheaves with wooden flails or having animals trample them. This process must be completed before winter rains begin, adding time pressure to already exhausting work. The grain must then be winnowed, separated from chaff by tossing it in baskets and letting wind blow away the lighter material. Each step in this process results in further losses. Grain is lost during cutting when overripe heads shatter. More is lost during bundling and transport. Still more is lost during threshing and winnowing. By the time you have clean grain ready for storage, you may have lost 30 to 40% of your potential harvest simply due to the primitive processing methods available to you. Storage is another constant source of anxiety and loss. You have no airtight containers, no chemical preservatives, no effective methods for preventing spoilage. Grain must be stored in baskets or bins that provide only minimal protection from moisture, rodents, and insects. Rats and mice consume significant quantities of stored grain. Moisture causes grain to rot or sprout, making it inedible. Insects multiply rapidly in stored grain, reducing both quantity and quality. The physical demands of medieval agriculture were so extreme that they permanently shaped peasant bodies and lifespans. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval peasants suffered from severe arthritis in their backs and joints, worn down by decades of backbreaking labour. Their bones show evidence of nutritional deficiencies that stunted growth and weakened their immune systems. Most peasants were physically exhausted and broken down by age 40, unable to continue the intense labour that farming required. In a society without retirement, disability insurance, or social support systems, becoming unable to work meant starvation and death. Elderly peasants who could no longer contribute to agricultural labour became burdens that their families often couldn't afford to support. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that peasants experienced cycles of killing over work, followed by periods of enforced idleness. During planting and harvest, you might work 16 to 18 hours a day for weeks at a time. During winter, when little agricultural work could be done, you faced months of hunger while having no opportunity to earn additional food or income. This seasonal unemployment was particularly devastating because it coincided with the period when stored food was running low and spring planting was still months away. The late winter and early spring months were known as the hunger months, when peasant families ate whatever remained of their stored food while trying to survive until the next harvest. Women's agricultural work was equally demanding, but often unrecognised in historical records. Women were responsible for tending vegetable gardens, caring for small animals like chickens and pigs, milking cows, making cheese and butter, brewing ale, and preserving food for winter storage. During harvest time, women worked alongside men in the fields, while also maintaining responsibility for domestic tasks like cooking and childcare. Children began contributing to agricultural labour as soon as they were physically capable. Typically around age 5 or 6, they scared birds away from crops, collected eggs, fed animals, and helped with harvesting and processing. Child labour wasn't considered exploitative. It was essential for family survival in an economy where every person's contribution was needed to generate barely enough food to stay alive. The psychological stress of agricultural work went far beyond physical exhaustion. Every peasant lived with the constant awareness that a single bad harvest could mean death for their entire family. This wasn't abstract worry. It was realistic assessment of their situation based on frequent experience of famine and starvation. The knowledge that your family's survival depended entirely on factors beyond your control. Weather, disease, pests, the decisions of your lord, created a level of chronic stress that modern people can barely comprehend. You could work harder than anyone should be expected to work, do everything right, and still watch your family starve because the rains came at the wrong time, or your lord decided to raise taxes. This combination of backbreaking physical labour, primitive technology, Economic exploitation and constant existential threat made medieval agriculture not just work, but a form of slow-motion torture that consumed entire lives in the desperate pursuit of bare survival. Let's talk about the food itself, or rather, the tragic lack of it that defined every moment of medieval peasant existence. When modern people think about bread, they imagine soft, fluffy loaves filled with nutrients and flavour. When you think about bread as a medieval peasant, you think about survival, desperation, and the constant creativity required to turn anything remotely edible into something that might keep you alive another day. Bread wasn't just food for medieval peasants. It was literally life itself. When people said, "Give us this day our daily bread," they weren't speaking metaphorically. Bread comprised 70 to 80% of your daily calories, assuming you were lucky enough to have daily calories at all. But the bread you ate bore no resemblance to anything modern people would recognize as food. Let's start with what went into medieval peasant bread during a good year. Your flour was made from whatever grains you were allowed to keep after paying taxes, tithes, and fees to your lord. This was typically the lowest quality grain, the stuff that was too poor to sell at market, or too damaged to use for other purposes. It might be barley, oats, rye, or wheat, but more likely it was a mixture of whatever grains were available, ground together regardless of their individual baking properties. The grinding process itself was another source of contamination and nutrition loss. You were required to use your lord's mill, paying a fee for the privilege, while watching the miller take another percentage of your grain as payment. The millstones weren't precisely fitted, so they ground fragments of stone into your flour. This stone dust wore down your teeth and added indigestible material to your already inadequate diet. The flour that emerged from this process was coarse, gritty, and often contaminated with debris, dirt, and various forms of organic matter that had made their way into the grain during harvesting and storage. There was no sifting, no refining, no removal of impurities. Whatever came out of the mill went into your bread. But here's where medieval bread gets truly horrifying. During bad years, which were frequent, you couldn't afford to make bread from grain alone. You stretched your meagre flour supplies by adding whatever other substances might provide calories, or at least make you feel full. These extenders included ground acorns, which were bitter and required extensive processing to remove toxins. Tree bark, particularly from oak and birch, was dried and ground into flour. Sawdust from woodcutting was mixed into dough to add bulk. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were dried and ground to supplement grain flour, but these added little nutritional value while making the bread heavy and difficult to digest. Peas and beans were ground into flour, but legume flour doesn't bind properly and created bread that crumbled apart and provided poor nutrition. During the worst famines, bread might contain more non-grain ingredients than actual flour. Historical records describe bread made from ground grass, dried leaves, crushed bones, and even earth. Yes, dirt was literally added to bread dough to create the illusion of substance and to help people feel full, even though it provided no nutrition and could cause serious intestinal problems. The baking process was another source of problems and expense. You couldn't bake bread in your own home because you didn't have an oven. Ovens were expensive to build and maintain, and fuel was too precious to waste on individual baking. Instead, you were required to use the communal ovens owned by your lord, paying yet another fee for the privilege. This meant that bread baking was scheduled according to the lord's convenience rather than when you needed fresh bread. You might bake once a week, or even less frequently, meaning that most of the bread you ate was stale, hard, and often mouldy. Mould wasn't removed from bread, it was considered part of the food. You ate around the worst spots and consumed the rest, ingesting toxins that contributed to illness and digestive problems. The bread that emerged from this process was dense, heavy, and barely edible by modern standards. It was often black or dark brown from the impurities in the flour and the burning that occurred in poorly controlled ovens. The texture was coarse and gritty from stone particles and vegetable matter. The taste was bitter from acorns, bark, and spoiled grain. But this terrible bread was still the best food available to you. It provided the majority of your calories and was treated with reverence because it literally meant the difference between life and death. Dropping a piece of bread on the ground was a minor tragedy. Wasting bread in any way was unthinkable. Children were taught to kiss bread before eating it and to collect every crumb that fell. When bread wasn't available, which happened frequently during poor harvests or the months before new grain was ready, you survived on pottage, a thin gruel made from whatever grain or vegetable matter you could find. Pottage was the food of absolute desperation, a watery soup that might contain a handful of grain, some turnips, maybe an onion if you were lucky. The preparation of pottage revealed the mathematical precision of starvation. You had to calculate exactly how much grain to use each day to make your supplies last until the next harvest. Too much, and you'd run out of food weeks before new grain was available. Too little, and you'd starve to death before using up your supplies. Families literally counted individual grains, measuring their daily pottage with desperate accuracy. Pottage was cooked in a single pot that hung over your fire, and it was rarely emptied completely. New ingredients were added as they became available, creating a perpetual stew that might continue for weeks or months. The bottom of the pot developed a layer of burnt, encrusted material that was scraped up and eaten because waste was unthinkable. The seasonal availability of food created cycles of feast and famine that dominated peasant life. Late summer and early fall, immediately after harvest, might provide a few weeks of relative abundance when you could actually eat until you felt full. But these periods were brief and followed by months of increasing hunger as stored food supplies dwindled. Winter was a time of careful rationing and constant hunger. Spring was worse, the hunger months when stored food was nearly exhausted, but new crops were still months from harvest. During these months, peasant families foraged for anything edible: early greens, tree buds, roots, bark, and anything else that might provide a few calories to sustain life. Foraging wasn't a supplement to regular meals. It was often the only thing standing between you and starvation. You learned to identify every edible plant in your area, when they could be safely harvested, and how to process them to remove toxins or improve digestibility. This knowledge was passed down through generations because it was literally survival information. Some foraged foods required extensive processing to be edible. Acorns, which were a major famine food, contained tannins that make them bitter and potentially toxic. They had to be ground, soaked in water for days to leach out the tannins, then dried and ground again before they could be used. This process took weeks of work to produce flour that was still inferior to grain. Tree bark, another common famine food, had to be harvested from specific trees at specific times of year. The inner bark was dried, ground, and mixed with whatever grain was available. It provided bulk and a small amount of nutrition, but it was difficult to digest and could cause serious intestinal problems if eaten in large quantities. The social aspects of food distribution within peasant families revealed the harsh realities of survival mathematics. Food wasn't distributed equally among family members. It was allocated based on each person's ability to contribute to the family's survival. Adult men, who did the heaviest agricultural work, received the largest portions. Women received less, and children received whatever remained. During severe famines, families faced impossible decisions about who would eat and who would go hungry. Children might be sent away to beg or to serve in wealthy households where they might find food. Elderly grandparents might receive smaller portions because their ability to work was limited. These weren't cruel decisions, but rational calculations about how to maximize the family's chances of survival. The psychological impact of chronic hunger was devastating and permanent. Children who grew up constantly hungry developed lasting anxieties about food scarcity. Adults who survived famines often became obsessive about hoarding food, even when it was no longer necessary. The mental energy required to constantly think about food acquisition and distribution left little capacity for other intellectual or creative pursuits. Hunger also affected physical and mental development in ways that lasted entire lifetimes. Children who didn't receive adequate nutrition during critical growth periods remained stunted as adults. Pregnant women who were malnourished gave birth to underweight babies with developmental problems. The cognitive effects of chronic malnutrition meant that entire populations had reduced intellectual capacity compared to well-fed populations. The religious significance of bread in medieval culture took on profound meaning when viewed through the lens of chronic hunger. The Christian communion ritual, where bread symbolically becomes the body of Christ, resonated deeply with people for whom bread was literally life itself. The Lord's Prayer's request for daily bread wasn't a casual request, but a desperate plea for survival. Church teachings about the virtue of poverty and the spiritual benefits of hunger provided ideological justification for a system that kept most people in a state of constant malnourishment. Peasants were told that their suffering brought them closer to God, that their empty stomachs were preparation for spiritual fulfillment, that their hunger was a form of voluntary fasting that would be rewarded in the afterlife. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of medieval peasant food culture was how little joy or pleasure it provided. Modern people eat for pleasure, for social connection, for cultural expression. Medieval peasants ate to avoid death. Food was fuel, nothing more. The concept of cuisine, of flavoring food for enjoyment, of eating as a social or cultural activity, was completely foreign to people whose entire relationship with food was defined by scarcity and desperation. Meals weren't social occasions, but desperate races against starvation. Families didn't gather around tables to share food and conversation. They huddled around pots of thin gruel, each person focused entirely on consuming their allocated portion as efficiently as possible. Children learned to eat quickly to prevent siblings from taking their food. Adults developed habits of protective eating that persisted even when food was available. The constant presence of hunger created a culture where food security was the highest possible aspiration. Peasants didn't dream of wealth, power, or adventure. They dreamed of having enough bread to eat every day. The ultimate fantasy wasn't owning land or achieving freedom. It was simply not being hungry. This relationship with food was passed down through generations, creating cultural patterns that persisted long after the medieval period ended. The peasant mentality of scarcity, waste avoidance, and food hoarding became embedded in rural cultures throughout Europe and continued to influence attitudes toward food and consumption for centuries. The bread of sorrow that sustained medieval peasants wasn't just inadequate nutrition. It was a daily reminder of their position in a social hierarchy that valued their lives so little that systematic starvation was considered an acceptable price for maintaining order. Every bite of gritty, contaminated bread was a testament to human endurance and a condemnation of the social systems that made such endurance necessary. The thin line between survival and death that defined medieval peasant life wasn't just about having enough food. It was about navigating a world where everything from the weather to minor injuries could quickly escalate into life-threatening crises. As a medieval peasant, you lived in a state of constant vulnerability where your next meal, your next winter, your next illness could be your last. This wasn't dramatic thinking. It was realistic assessment of your actual circumstances. Let's start with the most immediate threat: injury and illness in a world without medical care. As a peasant, your body was your only tool for survival. You had no machines, no assistance, no backup systems. Everything depended on your physical ability to work from dawn to dusk, day after day, year after year. A single serious injury could doom your entire family to starvation, but the agricultural work that kept you alive was extraordinarily dangerous. You worked with sharp tools, scythes, sickles, axes, knives that could cause devastating injuries with a moment's inattention. You handled large animals that could kick, bite, or trample you without warning. You climbed onto unstable structures to repair roofs and barns. You worked in all weather conditions when footing was treacherous and visibility was poor. A cut finger that became infected could progress to blood poisoning and death within days. A broken bone that didn't heal properly could leave you permanently disabled and unable to work. A back injury from lifting heavy loads could cripple you for life. In a world without antibiotics, surgery, or even basic first aid, minor injuries regularly became fatal. The lack of medical knowledge meant that peasants had no understanding of infection, disease transmission, or proper wound care. Injuries were treated with folk remedies that were often more harmful than helpful. Open wounds were packed with dirt, animal dung, or various plant materials that introduced additional bacteria. Broken bones were set by people with no anatomical knowledge, often healing incorrectly and causing permanent disability. Childbirth was a particularly deadly gamble for peasant women. Without trained midwives, sterile conditions, or emergency interventions, maternal mortality rates were catastrophically high. Women faced each pregnancy knowing they might not survive it, but they had no choice because children were essential for family survival and they had no access to contraception. The physical demands of peasant life often made pregnancy complications more likely. Women worked in the fields until the day they gave birth, performing heavy labor that increased the risk of miscarriage and complications. Malnutrition during pregnancy led to difficult births and unhealthy babies. Many women died from infections that developed after childbirth in unsanitary conditions. Children who survived birth faced their own deadly challenges. Infant mortality rates were so high that parents often didn't name children until they were several months old, recognizing that there was a good chance the child wouldn't survive. Common childhood diseases that are minor inconveniences today, measles, whooping cough, diarrhea, regularly killed medieval children whose immune systems were weakened by malnutrition. The seasonal cycles that governed agricultural life also created predictable health crises. Winter brought respiratory illnesses that thrived in crowded, poorly ventilated homes where families huddled together for warmth. Spring brought gastric illnesses as people consumed spoiled, stored food and foraged plants that were sometimes toxic. Summer brought dysentery and other diseases spread through contaminated water supplies. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of peasant health was the complete unpredictability of epidemic diseases. Plague, typhus, influenza, and other infectious diseases would sweep through communities without warning, killing large percentages of the population within weeks or months. These epidemics struck regardless of how hard people worked, how carefully they saved, or how devoutly they prayed. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 provides the most dramatic example of peasant vulnerability to forces beyond their control. This pandemic killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, but it affected peasants disproportionately because they couldn't flee to safer areas, couldn't afford better nutrition to strengthen their immune systems, and lived in crowded conditions that facilitated disease transmission. During the plague outbreaks, entire peasant families would die within days of each other, leaving empty huts and untended fields. Survivors found themselves inheriting land and property, but often in such devastated communities that there was no point in trying to farm. The social and economic disruption caused by epidemic diseases could persist for generations. Even when diseases weren't fatal, they could destroy peasant families' ability to survive. A father who became chronically ill couldn't perform the agricultural labor that fed his family. A mother who was weakened by repeated pregnancies and poor nutrition couldn't care for her children or contribute to household production. Children who were sickened by malnutrition couldn't help with essential farm work. The psychological stress of living with constant health threats was overwhelming. Peasants developed fatalistic attitudes toward illness and death because they had no control over these threats. and no effective treatments. They watched family members die from conditions that were easily treatable, knowing that their own deaths might come just as suddenly and inevitably. Religious explanations for illness and death provided some psychological comfort, but also added layers of guilt and anxiety. Diseases were often interpreted as divine punishment for sin, leading sick people to believe they were responsible for their own suffering. This belief system discouraged people from seeking practical solutions to health problems and encouraged them to accept preventable deaths as God's will. The few medical practitioners available to peasants were often more dangerous than the diseases they claimed to treat. Village healers practiced folk medicine based on superstition and tradition rather than scientific understanding. Their treatments, bloodletting, purging, various herbal concoctions, often weakened patients further and sometimes hastened death. Barber surgeons, who provided the closest thing to professional medical care available to common people, had minimal training and crude tools. They might attempt to set broken bones or remove infected teeth, but their interventions often caused more problems than they solved. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptic conditions, leading to shock, infection, and frequently death. The seasonal food shortages that characterized peasant life created predictable health crises that communities experienced year after year. During the hunger months of late winter and early spring, weakened populations became vulnerable to diseases that they might have survived during better fed periods. These seasonal epidemics became part of the expected rhythm of peasant life. Malnutrition didn't just make people more susceptible to infectious diseases, it also caused specific nutritional deficiency diseases that were endemic in peasant communities. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from lack of vitamin D, pellagra from lack of niacin, and various other deficiency diseases weakened peasant populations and contributed to high mortality rates. The cumulative effect of chronic malnutrition, dangerous working conditions, poor sanitation, and lack of medical care meant that peasant life expectancy was shockingly low. Most peasants who survived childhood could expect to live only into their 30s or 40s. Those who reached old age were often so weakened by decades of privation that they became burdens their families couldn't afford to support. Weather extremes created additional health threats that peasants were powerless to address. Unusually cold winters caused deaths from hypothermia and respiratory diseases. Heat waves led to dehydration and heat stroke among people who had to continue working outdoors, regardless of temperature. Flooding contaminated water supplies and spread waterborne diseases. The psychological toll of constant proximity to death created cultural patterns that seem alien to modern sensibilities. Peasant communities developed elaborate rituals for dealing with death because it was such a frequent occurrence. Children grew up expecting that many of their siblings would die young. Parents learned not to become too attached to infants because survival was so uncertain. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of peasant mortality was how often deaths were preventable with knowledge and resources that existed elsewhere in medieval society. While peasants died from infected wounds, wealthy people had access to physicians who could provide better care. While peasant children died from malnutrition, noble children were well fed and healthy. The same economic system that kept peasants in poverty also denied them access to the medical knowledge and treatments that could have saved their lives. Physicians trained at universities served wealthy clients, while peasants relied on folk remedies and prayer. Expensive medicines and treatments were available to those who could afford them, while peasants suffered and died from treatable conditions. This medical inequality wasn't just an unfortunate side effect of economic stratification, it was built into the social system. The lives of peasants were considered less valuable than the lives of their social superiors, so their deaths from preventable causes were accepted as natural and inevitable rather than tragic and unjust. The constant presence of death in peasant communities created a culture of resignation and fatalism that made it easier for the existing social order to perpetuate itself. When people expected to die young and accepted suffering as natural, they were less likely to question the systems that created these conditions or to demand better treatment. Yet despite living under these impossible conditions, many peasants displayed remarkable resilience and found ways to create meaning and joy even in the shadow of constant death. They developed strong community bonds based on mutual aid and shared struggle. They created folk traditions that celebrated life even while acknowledging its brevity and uncertainty. The dance with death that characterized medieval peasant life wasn't just about individual mortality. It was about entire communities learning to function while losing large percentages of their population regularly. Children learned to take on adult responsibilities when parents died. Communities developed systems for caring for orphans and widows. Survival became a collective effort that required everyone to adapt to constant loss. This intimate relationship with mortality gave peasant culture a depth and intensity that's difficult for modern people to understand. When life was precarious and death was always near, every day of survival was an achievement. Every harvest successfully completed was a victory against the forces trying to destroy you. Every child who lived to adulthood was a triumph over terrible odds. The medieval peasants' dance with death wasn't a graceful waltz, but a desperate struggle against overwhelming forces. Yet somehow, through sheer determination and mutual support, these communities managed to persist for centuries, passing life on to the next generation, despite conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Their endurance in the face of such adversity stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of human resilience. If you somehow managed to survive the backbreaking labour of harvest and the careful rationing of autumn, you still faced the ultimate test of medieval peasant endurance: winter. This wasn't the winter of modern imagination, with cosy fires and warm homes and plenty of stored food. This was a season of systematic deprivation that lasted 6 months and killed more peasants than war, plague and famine combined. Winter began not with the first snowfall, but with the last harvest of autumn. Once the final crops were gathered and the Lord's share extracted, you faced the terrifying mathematics of survival, calculating whether your remaining food stores could possibly last until spring planting produced new crops. The answer was usually no, which meant that winter became a race between the return of spring and the bottom of your grain sacks. Your home provided almost no protection against the brutal cold that would dominate your life for the next half year. The walls of your hut were made of wattle and daub, essentially sticks and mud, that provided minimal insulation and frequently developed cracks that let in wind and moisture. The roof was thatch that leaked constantly, creating damp conditions that made the cold even more penetrating. There were no windows in your hut, just small openings that could be covered with cloth or wooden shutters in bad weather. But covering these openings meant living in complete darkness during the short winter days, while leaving them open meant losing what little heat your fire could generate. You spent the winter months choosing between freezing in the light or shivering in darkness. Your floor was packed dirt that became muddy from roof leaks and tracked in snow. This mud never fully dried during winter, creating permanently damp conditions that bred disease and made every surface cold and clammy. You walked on this muddy floor with bare feet or crude wooden shoes that provided no warmth or protection. The single room where your entire family lived, worked and slept was also home to your animals, chickens, a pig, and perhaps a cow if you were fortunate. These animals provided some warmth, but they also contributed waste, odours and noise that made the already cramped conditions even more miserable. The smell of animal excrement mixed with unwashed human bodies, spoiled food and wood smoke created an atmosphere that would be unbearable to anyone not completely accustomed to it. Heating this inadequate shelter required fuel that you couldn't afford. Wood was scarce, and largely controlled by your lord, who charged fees for gathering dead branches and strictly forbade cutting living trees. Most peasants burned whatever combustible material they could find: dried animal dung, straw, dried peat if it was available, and scraps of wood too small for construction. These poor quality fuels produced more smoke than heat, filling your hut with acrid fumes that burned your eyes and damaged your lungs. The fire had to be carefully tended throughout the day and night, because letting it go out meant hours of work to restart it, assuming you had the materials to do so. Family members took turns staying awake to feed the fire, losing sleep that their malnourished bodies desperately needed. Even with a fire burning constantly, your hut was never warm. Temperatures inside might be only slightly higher than outside, and the uneven heating meant that areas near the fire were uncomfortably hot, while areas just a few feet away remained freezing cold. You learned to huddle as close to the fire as possible during the day, and to sleep in piles with your family members at night, sharing body heat for survival. Your clothing provided little protection against the cold. You owned perhaps 2 sets of clothes, one for work and one for church, made from rough wool or linen that was neither windproof nor waterproof. These clothes were rarely washed because soap was expensive and hot water was a luxury. So they became stiff with dirt and sweat, reducing their insulating properties further. You had no underclothing to trap body heat, no multiple layers to adjust for changing conditions, no waterproof outer garments to keep out rain and snow. When your clothes became wet from rain or snow, they stayed wet because there was no way to dry them thoroughly in your cold, damp hut. Wearing wet clothes in freezing temperatures was a constant source of misery and a frequent cause of illness. Your feet suffered particularly during winter because you had no adequate footwear. Shoes were expensive luxuries that most peasants couldn't afford, and even crude leather shoes provided little insulation against frozen ground. Many peasants wrapped their feet in rags or went barefoot even in snow, leading to frostbite, infections, and permanent damage. The short winter days meant that you lived in semi-darkness for months at a time. The sun might rise at 8 in the morning and set at 4 in the afternoon, giving you only 8 hours of weak daylight. But artificial lighting was another luxury you couldn't afford. Candles were made from animal fat that was too precious to burn for illumination, and oil lamps required fuel that was beyond your means. This meant that your productive hours were severely limited during winter. You couldn't work in the fields in darkness, couldn't do fine manual tasks without adequate light, couldn't safely move around your village during the long nights. Your world shrank to the small circle of firelight in your hut, and you spent most of your time in darkness or dim twilight. The psychological impact of living in cold, dark, cramped conditions for months at a time was devastating. Seasonal depression affected entire populations, though medieval people had no understanding of the condition or treatments for it. People became irritable, lethargic, and despondent during the long winter months, and family tensions often exploded into violence as the stress of survival wore down everyone's emotional reserves. Food storage during winter was a constant source of anxiety. Your grain was stored in baskets or bins that provided minimal protection from moisture, rodents, and insects. Damp conditions caused grain to rot or sprout, making it inedible. Rats and mice consumed significant quantities of your precious stores, and you had no effective methods for controlling these pests. The grain you managed to protect from spoilage and pests still had to be carefully rationed to last through the winter. Families developed elaborate systems for measuring daily food allowances, counting individual grains to make their supplies stretch as far as possible. Children learned arithmetic by calculating how many days their remaining food would last at current consumption rates. As winter progressed and food stores dwindled, families faced increasingly desperate choices about who would eat and who would go hungry. The elderly and very young were often given smaller portions because they were less essential for the family's survival. Pregnant women and nursing mothers received priority, but even they often went hungry when supplies ran short. The hunger months of late winter and early spring were periods of systematic starvation when stored food was exhausted but new crops were still months away from harvest. During these months, peasants foraged for anything remotely edible: tree bark, grass, roots, and whatever else might provide a few calories to sustain life. Foraging in winter was particularly dangerous because many plants were dormant or dead, and the few available food sources were often difficult to find under snow or ice. Peasants developed extensive knowledge of winter foraging, learning to find buried roots, strip bark from trees, and identify the few plants that remained edible through the cold months. The physical effects of winter malnutrition were severe and long-lasting. Adults lost significant weight and muscle mass, becoming skeletal figures by spring. Children who were malnourished during winter often showed permanent stunting and developmental delays. Pregnant women who didn't receive adequate nutrition frequently miscarried or gave birth to underweight babies. Winter was also the season when most peasant deaths occurred. Weakened by malnutrition and exposure to cold, people became vulnerable to respiratory diseases, influenza, and other infections that might not have been fatal during warmer, better-fed periods. Entire families might die during severe winters, leaving empty huts and unclaimed land. The lack of fresh food during winter meant that peasants suffered from various nutritional deficiency diseases. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C caused teeth to fall out and wounds to heal poorly. Rickets from lack of vitamin D caused bone deformities in children. These diseases weakened peasants further and made them more susceptible to other health problems. Work during winter was limited but still essential for survival. Peasants spent winter months repairing tools, mending clothes, processing stored food, and caring for animals. These indoor tasks were performed in the dim light and cold temperatures of unheated workshops, making even simple jobs difficult and uncomfortable. Women's work during winter included spinning and weaving, food preparation, and childcare, all performed in conditions that would challenge anyone's endurance. Spinning required good light and steady hands, both difficult to maintain in cold, dark conditions. Food preparation involved working with frozen or near-frozen ingredients using primitive tools and cooking methods. Animal care during winter was particularly challenging because domestic animals suffered from the same cold and food shortages as their human owners. Peasants had to share their already inadequate food supplies with animals that were essential for survival: cows for milk, chickens for eggs, pigs for eventual meat. Watching animals starve was heartbreaking, but feeding them adequately often meant taking food from human mouths. The social aspects of winter survival created both cooperation and conflict within peasant communities. Families shared resources when possible, but they also competed for the same limited supplies of food and fuel. Friendships could be destroyed over disputes about firewood gathering rights or accusations of food theft. Village communities developed systems for mutual aid during winter crises, but these systems were often inadequate to address the scale of need. Church-sponsored charity provided some relief, but it was sporadic and often came with conditions that made it as much about social control as genuine assistance. Winter deaths created particular challenges for peasant communities because frozen ground made burial difficult or impossible. Bodies often had to be stored until spring thaw allowed for proper interment, creating health hazards and psychological stress for survivors who lived with the reminders of mortality throughout the cold months. The arrival of spring brought relief, but also new challenges. Survivors of winter were often so weakened by months of privation that they could barely manage the physical demands of spring planting. The spring hunger continued until the first new crops became available, sometimes as late as midsummer for peasants whose stored food had been exhausted months earlier. Recovery from winter took months for peasants who had survived on starvation rations for half the year. Their bodies needed time to regain strength, their immune systems needed time to recover, and their psychological resilience needed time to rebuild after months of systematic deprivation. Yet somehow, Most peasants who survived one winter found the strength to face the next one, knowing that it would bring the same challenges and the same life-threatening privations. This cycle of winter survival repeated itself year after year, generation after generation, creating a population that was simultaneously incredibly resilient and systematically destroyed by the conditions they were forced to endure. The weight of winter wasn't just physical cold and hunger. It was the crushing psychological burden of knowing that every year brought a season designed to kill you, and that your only choice was to endure it as best you could while hoping to see another spring. For medieval peasants, winter wasn't just a season. It was an annual appointment with death that had to be faced with whatever resources and determination they could muster. After surviving the brutal cycles of agricultural labour, chronic starvation, constant health threats, and deadly winters, you might think the worst aspects of peasant life have been revealed. But there was something even more crushing than physical hardship, the complete absence of hope for anything better. As a medieval serf, you weren't just poor or hungry, you were legally trapped in a system designed to ensure that you and your children and your children's children would never escape the cycle of poverty and desperation that defined your existence. Understanding serfdom requires grasping a concept that modern people find almost incomprehensible. You are not legally a person. You are property. You belong to your lord as completely as his horses, his cattle, or his tools. You can be bought, sold, traded, or given away as a gift. You have no legal rights, no recourse against abuse, no protection beyond your lord's momentary goodwill. Your life, your labour, your body, and your future all belong to someone else. This wasn't slavery in the classical sense, because you weren't considered valuable enough to own outright. Slaves represented significant investments that their owners wanted to protect and maintain. Serfs were more like rental equipment, useful while functioning, disposable when broken, and easily replaced from the vast population of desperate people who had no other options. The legal documents that governed your life read like property inventories. When your lord died and his estate was inherited, you would be listed alongside the livestock and farming equipment. Item: 45 cattle, 12 horses, 67 serfs, 23 ploughs. Your value would be calculated based on your age, health, and ability to work, just like any other piece of farm equipment. You couldn't leave your lord's land without permission, which was rarely granted and always came with conditions that made departure impossible. If you tried to run away, you were considered a thief who had stolen yourself from your rightful owner. Other lords were legally required to return runaway serfs, and the punishment for attempted escape was usually a beating severe enough to prevent you from trying again. But even if you somehow managed to escape and reach another region where you weren't known, you couldn't simply start a new life. The feudal system was designed to prevent social mobility, and every aspect of medieval life required documentation of your status and origin. You couldn't rent land, join a guild, get married, or even enter a town without proving your legal status. A serf without documentation was automatically suspect and would be returned to their lord or punished as a vagrant. The marriage laws that governed serfs revealed the complete control that lords exercised over their human property. You couldn't marry without your lord's permission, and that permission usually came with a fee that most serfs couldn't afford. Your lord could forbid marriages that didn't serve his interests, force marriages that did, or claim the right to have sexual access to serf women before their wedding nights. When serf couples did marry, their children automatically belonged to whichever lord owned the mother, following the legal principle that human offspring followed the same rules as livestock breeding. Children born to serf parents had no hope of freedom and no legal protection against being separated from their families if their lord found it convenient or profitable. The inheritance laws for serfs were particularly cruel because they created the illusion of property ownership while ensuring that nothing of value ever accumulated in serf families. When a serf died, their lord claimed the right to take the family's best animal, tool, or piece of clothing as an inheritance tax. This Harriet payment often stripped grieving families of the resources they needed to survive, forcing widows and orphans into even more desperate poverty. Any property that serfs managed to accumulate during their lifetimes reverted to their lord upon death. Serfs couldn't write wills, couldn't leave inheritances to their children, and couldn't make any legal arrangements for their family's future welfare. The system was designed to prevent the accumulation of wealth across generations, ensuring that each generation of serfs started from the same position of absolute poverty. The legal system provided no protection for serfs against abuse, exploitation, or injustice. Serfs couldn't testify against their lords in court, couldn't file legal complaints, and couldn't seek justice through official channels. If your lord decided to beat you, rape your wife, steal your possessions, or kill your children, you had no legal recourse whatsoever. This absence of legal protection created opportunities for sadistic lords to abuse their human property without consequences. Some lords were relatively benevolent, but others were monsters who tortured and killed serfs for entertainment. The legal system not only failed to protect serfs from such abuse, it actively facilitated it by treating lords as absolute authorities over their human property. The economic obligations that bound serfs to their lords were calculated to extract maximum value while providing minimum survival resources. Beyond the corvée labour that required you to work your lord's land for free several days each week, you owed numerous other services and payments that consumed whatever time and resources remained. You might be required to provide military service during wars, leaving your family to tend your crops without your labour during crucial growing seasons. You might be required to maintain roads, bridges, and other infrastructure that benefited your lord's estate. You might be required to provide transportation services, carrying your lord's goods to market while your own crops rotted in the field. The monopoly rights that lords claimed over essential services created additional opportunities for exploitation. You were required to use your lord's mill to grind grain, paying fees that consumed significant portions of your harvest. You were required to use your lord's ovens to bake bread, his presses to make wine, his forges to repair tools, always paying fees that kept you in perpetual poverty. These monopolies weren't just economic arrangements. They were instruments of social control that ensured serfs remained dependent on their lords for basic survival needs. By controlling access to milling, baking, brewing, and other essential services, lords could punish disobedient serfs by denying them access to the means of survival. The tax obligations imposed on serfs were deliberately impossible to meet in full, creating permanent debt relationships that justified additional exploitation. Beyond the basic rent payments for land use, serfs owed various taxes, fees, and contributions that changed at their lord's whim. New taxes could be imposed for wars, weddings, castle construction, or any other expense that lords wanted their serfs to subsidize. These tax obligations were often paid in labor rather than money, because serfs rarely had access to cash. But labor payments allowed lords to claim even more of their serfs' time and energy, further reducing their ability to produce enough food for their own survival. The system created a vicious cycle where increased exploitation led to decreased productivity, which justified even more exploitation. The religious justification for serfdom was particularly insidious because it convinced serfs that their oppression was divinely ordained and therefore unquestionable. Church teachings emphasized that social hierarchy was God's will, that serfs were being punished for original sin, and that accepting their suffering with humility would be rewarded in the afterlife. Priests regularly preached that rebellion against social authority was rebellion against God, that poverty was a spiritual virtue, and that serfs should be grateful for the protection and guidance provided by their social superiors. These teachings were reinforced through religious rituals, church art, and cultural traditions that normalized inequality and made resistance seem not just futile, but sinful. The psychological impact of believing that your oppression was divinely mandated cannot be overstated. When people accept that their suffering is God's will, they stop looking for ways to improve their conditions and instead focus on enduring their trials with resignation. This religious conditioning was perhaps the most effective tool for maintaining social control in medieval society, but perhaps the most devastating aspect of serfdom was how it destroyed family relationships and community bonds. When survival required absolute submission to external authority, parents couldn't protect their children, spouses couldn't support each other, and communities couldn't provide mutual aid without their lord's permission. Children learned early that their parents were powerless to protect them from their lord's demands. Boys might be taken for military service, girls might be claimed for sexual exploitation, and families had no recourse except to submit. This powerlessness undermined parental authority and created family dynamics based on shared helplessness rather than mutual support. The communal aspects of serf life were heavily regulated by lords who understood that social bonds among serfs could become sources of resistance. Religious gatherings, village festivals, and other community activities were monitored and controlled to prevent the development of solidarity that might challenge the existing order. Even the traditional systems of mutual aid that helped peasant communities survive crises were subject to their lord's approval. Sharing food during famines, providing labour during emergencies, or caring for orphans and widows all required permission from authorities who might refuse such cooperation if it interfered with their own interests. The psychological conditioning required to accept serfdom began in infancy and continued throughout life. Children were taught to bow to their social superiors, to speak only when spoken to accept punishment without complaint, and to view their own desires and ambitions as irrelevant. This conditioning was so thorough that most serfs internalized their oppression and became willing participants in their own exploitation. The few serfs who managed to achieve freedom through military service, marriage, or exceptional service to their lords found that escaping legal bondage didn't necessarily mean escaping the economic and social structures that perpetuated inequality. Free peasants often lived in conditions that were barely better than those of serfs, and they remained vulnerable to exploitation by the same feudal elites who had previously owned them outright. The gradual decline of serfdom in later medieval periods wasn't driven by moral progress or enlightened thinking about human rights. Instead, economic changes made serf labour less profitable than wage labour, and lords began converting their human property into cash-paying tenants. This transition improved peasants' legal status, while often leaving their material conditions largely unchanged. The psychological scars left by centuries of serfdom persisted long after the legal institution had ended. Rural populations continued to display the deference, resignation, and acceptance of inequality that had been necessary for survival under feudal conditions. These cultural patterns influenced political and social development for centuries after the medieval period ended. Understanding serfdom helps explain why medieval peasants didn't simply revolt against their impossible living conditions. They weren't just facing economic hardship. They were trapped in a legal and ideological system that made resistance seem impossible, immoral, and pointless. The chains that bound them weren't just economic, but psychological, spiritual, and social. The serfs who lived and died under this system weren't passive victims who accepted their fate without question. Many found small ways to resist, to maintain dignity, and to preserve hope for their children's future. But they did so within constraints that modern people can barely comprehend, facing consequences for resistance that could destroy not just themselves, but their families and communities. The legacy of serfdom reminds us that legal freedom and human dignity aren't natural rights that automatically exist, but achievements that must be constantly defended against systems that seek to reduce human beings to mere instruments of production. The medieval serf's struggle for basic humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization speaks to fundamental questions about power, justice, and the value of human life that remain relevant today. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep with freedoms that medieval serfs couldn't even imagine, perhaps you'll spare a thought for the millions of people who lived and died as legal property, whose dreams of liberty were crushed by systems designed to extract value from human suffering while convincing its victims that their oppression was natural, necessary, and ordained by God himself. Their story isn't just about medieval history. It's about the human capacity to endure the unendurable while maintaining hope for something better, even when that hope seemed completely irrational. In their struggle for dignity within systems designed to deny their humanity, medieval serfs demonstrated resilience that continues to inspire and humble those who learn their story.